When an avoidant finally comes face to face with the reality that they shattered your heart, the moment rarely unfolds the way most people imagine. It isn't marked by a dramatic revelation or an instant flood of remorse. There is no sudden breakthrough where everything becomes clear at once. Instead, the realization tends to arrive quietly. It slips into their awareness through ordinary moments they never expected to matter. Maybe it's an old photograph they stumble across while scrolling through their phone. Maybe it's a familiar song that suddenly carries a weight it never had before. Maybe it's a memory they once pushed aside that refuses to stay buried any longer. Avoidants are not known for processing emotional loss as it happens. More often, they experience it long after the relationship has ended. The impact reaches them when the distractions fade, when the silence becomes impossible to ignore, and when the person who once brought comfort and warmth is no longer there to soften the loneliness around them. That is where their internal breaking point often begins. For many avoidants, there is a blind spot when it comes to emotional connection. They often misread love. What was genuine care can feel like pressure. What was patience can feel like expectation. What was closeness can feel threatening. While they are in the relationship, they frequently create distance because vulnerability feels unsafe. Opening up emotionally can feel overwhelming. Genuine intimacy can trigger fears they have spent years trying to avoid. As a result, they pull away. They shut down. They create walls. Not because the connection lacks value, but because being truly seen feels frightening. The irony is that while they are pushing you away, they often assume you will remain. They believe your understanding will continue. They expect your patience to last. They trust that no matter how much distance they create, you will still be there when they are ready. Rarely do they fully prepare themselves for the possibility that one day you may stop trying. And when that day arrives, it creates an emotional shock they never anticipated. Avoidants often struggle to understand the depth of a loss until it becomes permanent. They don't fully grasp what someone meant to them while that person is still available. The significance becomes clear only when access to that love is gone. The value becomes visible only after it can no longer be reached. And sometimes, they don't fully understand what love was until they are standing in its absence. During the relationship, many convince themselves they are happier without emotional dependence. They tell themselves they don't need closeness. They tell themselves they don't need support. They tell themselves they don't need the relationship. To protect themselves from old wounds, they create space and convince themselves that distance equals freedom. But eventually, something begins to change. The distance that once felt comfortable starts feeling empty. The independence that once felt empowering starts feeling lonely. The silence they once protected becomes difficult to sit with, and the solitude they worked so hard to preserve slowly transforms into a place where regret has room to grow. In the beginning, there is usually relief. That relief is common. When the relationship ends or emotional distance is established, it can feel as though a heavy burden has been removed. The expectations are gone. The vulnerability is gone. The pressure they associated with intimacy is gone. For a while, they convince themselves they made the right decision. They immerse themselves in work. They focus on hobbies. They spend time with friends. They keep moving. They stay busy. Anything is better than slowing down long enough to examine what they are feeling underneath. But relief rarely lasts forever. Gradually, reality begins to catch up with them. The distractions lose some of their power. The routines become familiar. Life becomes quieter. Then the reminders begin to appear. They walk past places that once held shared memories. They encounter small details that unexpectedly bring you back into their mind. Moments they once dismissed suddenly carry meaning. And little by little, they begin to feel the absence they spent so much time avoiding. That is often when the truth starts to surface. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly enough that they can no longer escape it. The person they kept at a distance was also the person who offered comfort, understanding, and emotional safety. The love they minimized was real. The connection they questioned mattered, and the heart they took for granted eventually reached its limit. When they finally recognize the pain their actions caused, they are often left facing something they have spent years running from: the consequences of emotional avoidance. The realization that protecting themselves from vulnerability may have cost them someone who genuinely cared. And for many avoidants, that awareness becomes the most difficult part of all. Because by the time they understand what they lost, the person who loved them may have already chosen to heal, move forward, and stop waiting. The realization deepens when they find themselves reaching for memories of you during difficult moments. When stress builds, your voice surfaces in their mind. When life feels overwhelming, they remember the comfort they once had access to. And when they attempt to build a connection with someone new, they often discover something unexpected. The comparison begins, not because they're trying to recreate the past, but because they start noticing what is missing. The emotional depth, the understanding, the patience, the willingness to stay present through difficult conversations. The warmth that once felt ordinary suddenly becomes impossible to replace. That is when the cracks begin to form. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, not through emotional breakdowns or grand confessions. The shift happens internally, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. They begin revisiting moments they once dismissed. Conversations they barely acknowledged now replay in their thoughts. They remember the lengthy messages you wrote while trying to explain your feelings. They remember the times you fought to clear up misunderstandings instead of walking away. They remember how hard you worked to create closeness while they continued creating distance. Details they ignored at the time suddenly become impossible to overlook. They remember the sadness in your eyes when their walls went up. They remember the hurt in your voice after another emotional shutdown. They remember the confusion you carried when they withdrew without giving you any explanation at all. These memories rarely arrive together. Instead, they appear one piece at a time. A thought here, a memory there, a reminder triggered by something small and unexpected. Each one brings another layer of awareness, and with that awareness comes guilt. For an avoidant, guilt can be particularly difficult to process. Rather than talking about it openly, they often carry it internally. They bury it beneath distractions. They push it aside. They convince themselves it isn't there. But emotions that are never addressed do not disappear. They accumulate. Over time, the weight becomes heavier. The burden becomes harder to ignore. And eventually, they find themselves carrying something they can no longer outrun. Then comes the realization they fear more than almost anything else. The moment they recognize that you have truly healed. Not that you've become angry, not that you've become distant, but that you've emotionally moved forward. You are no longer waiting for them to change. You are no longer holding on to hope. You are no longer standing in the same place where they left you. The person who once invested so much energy into loving them has finally chosen themselves. And that realization can hit with tremendous force. Ironically, it is often not your absence that affects them the most. It is the permanence of your growth. The understanding that the door they assumed would always remain open may no longer be available. Many avoidants unconsciously expect the people who love them to remain emotionally attached. They assume there will always be another opportunity, another conversation, another chance to return when they feel ready. They expect the emotional bond to stay frozen in place, even while they continue pulling away. But when they discover that your life has continued without them, something shifts inside. A sense of panic can emerge, not because you left, but because they finally understand what was lost. What breaks them is not simply separation. It is recognizing that they pushed away someone who genuinely cared, someone who stayed longer than most people would have, someone who offered patience, understanding, and love despite repeated disappointment. They begin to see that while they were focused on protecting themselves from emotional risk, they were also damaging something valuable, something rare, something meaningful. And this awareness is rarely handled with grace. Some avoidants respond by becoming even busier. Some create new distractions. Some search for explanations that make them feel less responsible. Others convince themselves that you are too emotional, too demanding, or too sensitive. Anything that allows them to protect their self-image. Anything that helps them avoid confronting the deeper truth. But despite those efforts, the realization keeps returning, again and again. A quiet thought that refuses to disappear. A truth they cannot fully silence. I hurt someone who genuinely wanted the best for me. I pushed away someone who cared. I damaged a connection that was real. Those thoughts tend to surface most strongly during the quietest hours, late at night, when the noise of the day disappears, when there are no conversations, no work obligations, and no distractions left to hide behind. In those moments, they are left alone with their memories, alone with their choices, alone with the growing awareness that the person they took for granted may have been one of the few people who truly saw them, accepted them, and loved them despite the walls they spent years building. And for many avoidants, that realization becomes the beginning of their deepest internal reckoning. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is the belief that they don't feel deeply. The reality is often very different. The emotions are there, the attachment is there, the loss is there. The difference is that many of those feelings arrive long after the relationship has changed. While others process heartbreak in the moment, avoidants often experience it in reverse. What was pushed aside eventually resurfaces. What was ignored eventually demands attention. And when it does, the emotional impact can be overwhelming. A simple memory can suddenly carry enormous weight. They may find themselves remembering your smile and feeling a sharp sense of longing they cannot explain away. They may revisit old conversations and finally recognize the effort, patience, and care that was hidden inside your words. They may read through messages they once skimmed past and feel a wave of guilt that wasn't present before. They may pause on an old photograph and realize something they never fully appreciated at the time. With you, they felt accepted. With you, they felt understood. With you, they experienced a level of safety that they rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge. Many of those realizations arrive only after the connection is gone. The feelings they kept hidden, the gratitude they never expressed, the love they struggled to receive. All of it begins to surface, and with every memory, the truth becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. They are no longer grieving only the relationship. They are grieving their role in its destruction, because eventually they understand that they did not simply lose someone important. They hurt someone who cared deeply. They damaged a heart that had shown up for them again and again. They wounded a person who continued offering understanding long after most people would have walked away. That awareness can be incredibly painful. Not because they suddenly become different overnight, but because they begin seeing the consequences of their actions with a level of clarity they previously lacked. The breaking point for an avoidant is rarely a single event. It is rarely one conversation, one memory, or one realization. Instead, it builds gradually, piece by piece, memory by memory, regret by regret. It is the slow accumulation of understanding, the realization that the behaviors they relied on to protect themselves may have ultimately cost them the very thing they were searching for. The walls they built for safety became barriers to connection. The distance they created became separation. The avoidance that once felt protective eventually became loss. And when that truth settles in, many find themselves confronting a painful reality. They pushed away loyalty. They rejected consistency. They created distance from someone who genuinely wanted to stay, someone who chose them repeatedly, someone who believed in the relationship even during its most difficult moments. By the time this awareness reaches them, however, life has often moved forward. You are no longer standing in the same emotional place. You have adapted. You have grown. You have learned how to function without the uncertainty that once consumed so much of your energy. You have learned how to create peace without waiting for their validation. You have rebuilt parts of yourself that were damaged by the cycle of closeness and withdrawal. And perhaps most importantly, you have stopped measuring your worth through their ability to show up. That transformation can be incredibly difficult for an avoidant to witness. Not because they dislike your happiness, not because they want you to suffer, but because your healing forces them to see the situation more honestly. When they see you smiling again, when they see you moving forward, when they see you no longer emotionally affected by their presence or absence, it becomes harder to deny what happened. Your peace becomes evidence. Evidence that you survived what they thought might keep you attached forever. Evidence that you found strength without them. Evidence that the relationship was not the only path available to you. For many avoidants, this realization creates a unique kind of pain, because your growth highlights what they could not fully receive when it was offered. They begin to recognize the quality of the love that was available to them. They see the patience. They see the loyalty. They see the emotional depth. And they understand, perhaps for the first time, what was standing in front of them all along. Not everyone reaches this awareness, but those who do often carry a quiet grief that few people ever witness. They rarely discuss it openly. They rarely reveal how much they think about it. Instead, it remains private. An internal sadness built from opportunities missed, words left unsaid, and connections that were never fully embraced. And sometimes, after enough time has passed, they return. Many avoidants do reach out eventually, not always because they have changed, not always because they have healed, but because the loss finally caught up with them. Yet this is where many people become confused. The return itself is not proof of transformation. Missing someone is not the same as becoming emotionally available. Regret is not the same as growth. And longing for connection is not the same as developing the capacity to sustain it. That is why, when avoidants come back, they often return carrying the same unresolved fears, the same emotional defenses, and the same patterns that created the distance in the first place. They come back feeling the loss. But they do not always come back as the version of themselves you spent so long hoping they would become. This continuation flows naturally from the previous sections and maintains the reflective, emotionally layered style used throughout your avoidant decoded content. When avoidants return, they often come back carrying a complicated mix of emotions. There is longing, there is regret, there is nostalgia, there is curiosity about what might have been. But there is also hesitation. The walls that existed before do not disappear overnight. The fears that shaped their behavior are rarely gone simply because enough time has passed. Many return not because they have fully transformed, but because the absence of the connection has finally become impossible to ignore. They miss the comfort they once had. They miss being understood without needing to explain everything. They miss the emotional security that was quietly present while you were in their life. The closeness they once resisted now becomes something they crave. The support they took for granted now feels irreplaceable. And so they return, hoping to reconnect with something that once made them feel safe. But what often surprises them is what they find. You are no longer the same person they left behind. The version of you that endlessly waited has evolved. The version of you that accepted emotional inconsistency without question has grown. The version of you that sacrificed your own needs in hopes of keeping the relationship alive no longer exists. Now there are boundaries. Now there is self-respect. Now there is an understanding that love must be mutual to survive. And for many avoidants, seeing this change can be deeply confronting. Because suddenly they are faced with something they spent years avoiding: themselves. Your growth becomes a mirror. Your healing reflects back the consequences of choices they never fully examined. Your strength forces them to look at realities they once kept buried beneath distance, distractions, and emotional defenses. But there is an important truth that often gets overlooked. Their awakening is not your responsibility. Their regret does not exist to provide you with closure. Their pain is not a reward for what you endured. You were never meant to carry the burden of someone else's unresolved wounds. You were never meant to sacrifice your well-being in order to heal another person's fears. You loved sincerely. You gave your effort. You communicated. You stayed through moments that tested your patience. You offered understanding, even when it wasn't always returned. You showed up with an open heart. And eventually, after exhausting every option you knew, you made one of the most difficult decisions a person can make. You chose yourself. You stepped away from someone you cared deeply about because continuing to stay was costing you too much. You stopped abandoning your own needs in order to preserve a connection that could not fully meet you. That choice was not weakness, it was courage, it was self-respect, it was growth. And in many cases, that very moment becomes the beginning of the avoidance realization. Because once you stop chasing, stop fixing, and stop waiting, they are left alone with the consequences of what they pushed away. Their awakening often begins where your healing starts. Eventually, many arrive at a painful understanding. The thing they spent so much time fearing was never love itself. The danger was never genuine connection. Vulnerability was not the enemy. The real loss came from refusing those things. The real pain came from letting someone valuable walk away because they were too afraid to fully receive what was being offered. And for some, the realization becomes impossible to ignore. They discover that the heart they were trying to protect may have cost them the heart that was trying to love them. Yet even that realization should not become the center of your story, because your life is larger than their regrets. Their lessons belong to them. Their growth belongs to them. Their healing belongs to them. What matters most now is the path you are creating for yourself. You survived an experience that could have left you bitter. Instead, you learned. You adapted. You grew stronger. You became someone who understands the difference between chasing love and receiving it. You outgrew the version of yourself that remained stuck waiting for potential. You learned that real connection requires participation from both people. And through that process, you developed a deeper understanding of your own value. Today, you stand in a different place, more aware, more resilient, more grounded in who you are. You no longer need someone else's approval to validate your worth. You no longer need someone else's readiness to determine your future. Your value was never dependent on whether another person could recognize it. So let their realization remain exactly what it is. A lesson in their journey, a chapter in their story, not the conclusion of yours. If their awakening teaches you anything, let it be this. You were never difficult to love. You were never asking for too much. You were offering something real to someone who lacked the ability to fully receive it at that point in their life. And because of that, your future should not be built around what they lost. It should be built around what you discovered, your strength, your resilience, your capacity to heal, and your willingness to choose yourself when it mattered most. Move forward, knowing that the love you gave still holds value. It was not wasted simply because it was not returned in the way you deserved. It revealed the depth of your heart. It revealed your ability to care. And it prepared you for relationships where that same effort can be met, appreciated, and reciprocated. The next chapter is not about waiting for someone to realize your worth. It is about fully recognizing it yourself. And from that place, you can walk forward with confidence, clear boundaries, and a steady sense of peace, knowing that choosing yourself was never the end of your story. It was the beginning of the life you were always meant to create.